June 11, 1940. As the first rays of dawn fell upon Malta, the island's people hadn't even woken yet. The clock showed 4:30 a.m., and at that exact moment, the sky turned dark. 55 Italian bomber aircraft took off from Sicily. Target? This tiny British island in the heart of the Mediterranean. Accompanying them were 18 Maltese C-200 fighter planes, modern, fast, and deadly. So, who would defend Malta? A single radar station, a few anti-aircraft batteries, and 3 outdated biplane aircraft freshly unpacked from wooden crates. Yes, you heard that right. 3 planes. What's more, there weren't even fighter pilots on the island to fly them. The 6 pilots who volunteered had never flown a fighter plane before. They had only flown seaplanes and cargo aircraft. And now, these 6 rookie pilots, with these 3 antique planes, would stand against the entire Italian Air Force. This was the beginning of one of history's most insane, most desperate, and most inspiring defense stories. If these videos interest you and you don't want to miss the unknown heroic stories of World War II, subscribe now, because this story is just getting started. Malta, a tiny island lying in the heart of the Mediterranean, between Sicily and Tunisia, 1/5 the size of London. But its strategic importance? Enormous. Gibraltar to the west, Egypt and the Suez Canal to the east, Malta was the only British base between these 2 critical points. It was perfectly positioned to intercept Italian and German supply convoys heading to North Africa. That's exactly why the enemy had their eyes on this island. But when war broke out in 1939, the British government made a strange decision. They declared Malta undefensible. They withdrew the navy to Alexandria. They recalled the aircraft. The island was left almost completely defenseless. They even went further, considering giving Malta to Mussolini as a bribe to keep Italy out of the war. Yes, really. Fortunately, this plan was never implemented. But as a result, when Italy entered the war in June 1940, Malta had no modern fighter aircraft. None at all. So, what happened in this hopeless situation? This is where the story gets interesting. In early 1940, the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious had stopped at Malta's harbor. In the ship's cargo hold were 18 Gloster Gladiator aircraft, packed in wooden crates. These planes were, how should I put it, practically antiques. Biplanes with open cockpits and designs reminiscent of World War I. Their maximum speed was around 250 miles per hour. Meanwhile, Italian Maltese C-200 fighter planes could reach 313 miles per hour. Even Italian Savoia Marchetti 79 bombers could hit 290 miles per hour. In other words, enemy bombers were faster than these fighter planes. When HMS Glorious left for the Norway campaign, it took back 3 of these crates. 3 were sent to Egypt. The remaining 12 crates were forgotten in Malta. And these forgotten crates would become the island's only hope. May 1940, Air Commodore Mairnd, the Air Force commander, put out a call. Volunteer pilots needed. The conditions weren't clear. The planes were outdated. The enemy had overwhelming superiority. And no reinforcements were coming. Despite this, 6 pilots immediately stepped forward. Flight Lieutenant George Burges, Commodore Maynard's personal aide. He had only flown a Gladiator a few times before, but he wasn't afraid of the odds. Flying Officer William Timber Woods, an experienced pilot but a novice when it came to fighter aircraft. Flight Lieutenant Peter Hartley, a brave man from the Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Unit. Flying Officer John Waters had received brief training with a Navy squadron in March.
Flight Lieutenant Peter Keeble came from Headquarters Flights. Squadron Leader Alan Jock Martin, the most experienced of the group. These 6 men gathered around 4 aircraft unpacked from the crates. Mechanics worked day and night to assemble the planes. There were no spare parts. Some components were stripped from other aircraft. One plane, named Faith, even had an engine taken from a Bristol Blenheim bomber. And so, the legendary Hall-Far fighter flight was born. Italy officially entered the war on June 10, 1940. The next day, the first attack came with the dawn. 55 Italian bombers and 18 fighters were advancing toward Malta. Targets: Hall-Far Airfield, Valletta Harbor, and Calafrana Seaplane Base. When radar operators detected the enemy aircraft, 3 Gladiators immediately took off. Flight Lieutenant George Burges was the first pilot to make contact with the enemy, but the bombs had already begun to fall. The pilots were shocked by what they saw. The sky was filled with Italian aircraft, and they were only 3. But they didn't retreat. Despite their clunky design, the Gladiators dove into the enemy formations. The Italian pilots were stunned. They had thought no one on this tiny island would resist them. That day, bombs fell. Damage was done. But something else happened too. The people of Malta looked up at the sky and saw their own planes fighting. Those small biplanes were bravely battling against massive enemy formations. This sight was the first spark of a resistance that would last for the next 2.5 years. The Gladiator pilots quickly realized a truth. They could never win with conventional tactics. Enemy aircraft were faster, more agile, and vastly superior in numbers. If a Gladiator engaged an Italian fighter one-on-one, defeat was inevitable. That's why they had to get creative. George Burges developed a tactic. Instead of waiting by their aircraft, pilots would sit ready in the cockpit. The moment an alarm sounded, they would take off immediately. This way, they could reach critical altitude before the enemy aircraft arrived. According to Burges's calculations, this tactic gave them an extra 2,000 feet of altitude before enemy bombers arrived, and altitude was everything in aerial combat. There was another tactic as well. Instead of attacking the bombers directly, the Gladiators would engage the fighter escorts. This prevented the bombers from focusing on their targets, forcing them to drop their bombs randomly and flee. Flight Lieutenant James Pickering would later describe those days like this. You'd take off in a Gladiator, climb toward the Italians alongside the few hurricanes on the island. Sometimes there'd be over 100 aircraft facing you. Clouds of bombers and fighters would fill the sky. And then, suddenly, you'd find yourself completely alone, because everyone else had passed you by. Yes, the Gladiators were so slow that even their own teammates left them behind. But these brave pilots kept fighting anyway. June 22, 1940, a day that would go down in Malta's history. That day, a single Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-79 reconnaissance aircraft was spotted over the island. 2 Gladiators immediately took off. Flight Officer Timber Woods made the first attack, but failed to score a hit. Then, Flight Lieutenant George Burges took over. Burges pursued the Italian bomber. He fired his machine guns, once, twice, and then both engines of the Italian aircraft burst into flames. The plane turned into a fireball right above Sliema and Valletta, in front of hundreds of watching Maltese. George Burges later described that moment. It happened right over Sliema and Valletta. It caused quite a bit of excitement. The Italian aircraft crashed into the sea off Grand Harbor. 2 of the 6 crew members survived and became the first prisoners of war in Malta. This victory might have seemed small from a military standpoint, but its psychological impact was enormous.
The people of Malta saw that those little biplanes in the sky could actually fight, could actually win. The flame of hope had begun to burn. The next day, Burges shot down another Mach-E C-200 fighter. The legend was growing. As the days passed, the people of Malta fell in love with their small defenders in the sky. Every day, with every attack, 3 gladiators would take off. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3, but they were always there. Maltese citizens watched these aerial battles from their balconies, rooftops, and streets. In the clear Mediterranean sky, they watched in admiration as the small biplanes bravely attacked the massive enemy formations. And a Maltese newspaper gave these aircraft special names: Faith, Hope, Charity. These 3 names were the 3 cardinal virtues of Christianity. And for this deeply religious island people, these aircraft were no longer just metal and rivets. They had become symbols. Symbols of resistance, faith, and hope. In reality, 6 aircraft were used in operations, some as spare parts sources, but the people always saw 3 of them in the sky. And this trio represented Malta's spirit: faith, hope, and charity. These names would echo around the world in the years to come. The 10 days between June 11–21, 1940 were one of the most critical periods in Malta's history. During these 10 days, the pilots of Faith, Hope, and Charity formed Malta's only air defense. There were no reinforcements. The hurricanes hadn't arrived yet. Just these 3 antique aircraft and 6 volunteer pilots. Over 10 days, a total of 144 Italian bombers and fighters flew over Malta, and every time, 3 gladiators met them. The pilots were exhausted. The aircraft constantly needed repairs. Spare parts were almost non-existent. The mechanics worked miracles. But not a single day, not a single attack went unanswered. By the end of these 10 days, the gladiators had shot down several enemy aircraft and damaged more. But their real achievement wasn't in the numbers. The real achievement was keeping Malta's morale alive. The people saw their island, declared indefensible, being defended. And that changed everything. This story that began on June 11, 1940, was just beginning. In the months and years ahead, Malta would become the most bombed place on Earth. In April 1942, the island would receive more bombs in a single month than London did during the entire Blitz. Pilots would come and go, hurricanes and later Spitfires would reach the island. But the spark ignited by faith, hope, and charity would never go out. And on April 15, 1942, King George VI would make history by awarding the George Cross Medal to the entire island of Malta, the first and only George Cross ever given not to an individual but to an entire people. The King's letter read, "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." But all of that would come later. For now, in the hot days of June 1940, 3 antique aircraft and 6 brave pilots continued to accomplish the impossible. In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at the incredible stories of these pilots. We'll see George Burges's unbelievable victories, Peter Hartley's tragic fall, and how Malta held out against the German Luftwaffe. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And tell us in the comments what you think about faith, hope, and charity.
Welcome back to Part 2. In the first episode, we saw the birth of faith, hope, and charity. We told the story of how 3 antique aircraft and 6 volunteer pilots defied the entire Italian Air Force. But this story was just beginning. Now we'll dive into the individual stories of these brave pilots. We'll see how George Burges earned Malta's first war medal, how Peter Hartley fell from the sky in flames, and the days when the German Luftwaffe turned the island into hell. Are you ready? If you pay attention throughout this episode, you'll learn one of the least known but most dramatic stories of World War II. If this type of content interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Flight Lieutenant George Burges. This name holds a special place in Malta's war history. Burges wasn't actually a fighter pilot. He was normally a flying boat pilot, meaning he flew large reconnaissance aircraft that landed on water. But in June 1940, he volunteered and found himself in an open cockpit biplane. And this man would become the pilot to score Malta's first aerial victory. June 22, 1940. That day, a single Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-79 bomber was conducting a reconnaissance flight over Malta. Burges and Timber Woods immediately took off. Woods made the first attack, but failed to score a hit. Then Burges took over. He directed his Gladiator toward the enemy aircraft, fired his machine guns, and both engines of the Italian bomber burst into flames. Burges described that moment. It happened right over Sliema and Valletta and caused quite a bit of excitement. The aircraft turned into a fireball and crashed into the sea in front of hundreds of watching Malteses. 2 of the 6 crew members survived and became Malta's first prisoners of war. The next day, June 23, Burges was in the cockpit again. This time, he faced a Machi 200 fighter, a machine much faster and more agile than the Gladiator. Under normal circumstances, a Gladiator shouldn't engage a C-200 in one-on-one combat, but Burges wasn't fighting under normal circumstances. The tactic was simple but brilliant. As the Italian pilot tried to pass the Gladiator, Burges reduced his speed. The faster Italian aircraft suddenly overshot in front of Burges, and at that moment, Burges opened fire. The Italian fighter burst into flames. The pilot bailed out with his parachute. 2 kills in 2 days, and this was just the beginning. Mid-July 1940. George's record looked like this. Confirmed kills: 2 SM-79 bombers, 1 MC-200 fighter. Probable kills: 1 SM-79, 1 CR-42. Damaged: 3 SM-79, 1 CR-42, and more. And on July 19, 1940, the reward came. King George VI awarded Flight Lieutenant George Burges the Distinguished Flying Cross. This was Malta's first war decoration. The medal citation read, "Although normally a flying boat pilot and transferred to fighter duties since the commencement of hostilities with Italy, Flight Lieutenant Burges has destroyed 3 enemy aircraft and damaged 3 others probably beyond repair. Although generally opposed by superior machines, he has displayed great determination and keenness to engage in combat." Note that phrase, "although generally opposed by superior machines." This sentence summarized the reality for Faith, Hope, and Charity's pilots. Every day, they fought against aircraft faster, more powerful, and more modern than their own, and yet they kept winning. Burges continued fighting even after the hurricanes arrived. In January 1941, when the German Luftwaffe came to Malta, Burges was flying a Hurricane. And on January 18, flying 4 sorties in a single day, he shot down 2 U-87 Stukas. With this achievement, he reached ace status, 5 or more kills. Burges's story was proof of how an ordinary person can transform into a hero under extraordinary circumstances. But every story has a dark side, and one of the most painful scenes in Malta's heroic epic occurred on July 31, 1940. That morning, radar operators detected a single Italian bomber approaching, but this bomber wasn't alone. It was accompanied by 9 Fiat CR-42 fighters. This was the largest fighter escort seen up to that point. 3 Gladiators immediately took off. Flying Officer Peter Hartley led an N-5519 Charity. With him were Timber Woods and Eric Taylor. At 18,000 feet, directly above Valletta, the air battle began.
Wood shot down Italian commander Capitano Antonio Chiodi. Chiodi's aircraft crashed into the sea 5 miles east of Grand Harbor. But the battle wasn't over. Italian pilots dove on the Gladiator seeking revenge, and Sergente Magno Terentino hit Hartley's aircraft right in the fuel tank. Peter Hartley later described that moment. Suddenly, the big radial engine in front of me was engulfed in flames. The forward fuel tank had been hit. Fire quickly spread into the cockpit, and I was only wearing shorts and a shirt. Yes, you heard that right. In Malta's hot summer days, pilots flew wearing only shorts and shirts. There was no protective clothing. And now, the price of this shortcoming was about to be paid. Hartley continued, "I was in such agony that I would have jumped even without my parachute." As flames engulfed his body, Hartley threw himself out of the cockpit. His parachute opened, and he began drifting toward the sea. But the burns had already done their damage. A rescue boat from Calafrana pulled him from the water. His face, neck, hands, and legs were covered with severe burns, third-degree burns. Doctors feared for his life. For 2 weeks, Hartley battled death. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief when doctors at Imtarfa Military Hospital could finally report he was apparently out of immediate danger. Hartley eventually recovered. He even returned to flying, but his wounds followed him for life, and he was eventually assigned to ground duties. And Charity? The legendary aircraft sank into the sea off Malta's southeast coast near Fort St. Leonardo. It was the only Gladiator Malta lost in aerial combat. While pilots fought in the sky, another battle was being waged on the ground, and the heroes of this battle were the mechanics. Think about it. You have 6 antique aircraft, no spare parts. The manufacturing factory is thousands of miles away, and every day enemy bombers rain bombs on your runway. How do you keep the aircraft flying under these conditions? The answer? Creativity, determination, and sleepless nights. Malta's mechanics worked miracles. They took engines stripped from Blenheim bombers and installed them in Gladiators. They replaced 2-bladed propellers with 3-bladed ones. They sourced armor plating from Malta Dockyard. Every night, aircraft damaged in the day's fighting were repaired. Every morning, pilots could take off again. But it wasn't just the aircraft. The runway was constantly under attack. Bombs created craters, and each crater could prevent an aircraft from taking off or landing. This is where Maltese civilians stepped in. As soon as attacks ended, hundreds of Maltese men and women rushed to the runways. With shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, they filled the craters. Sometimes in hours, sometimes in minutes, the runway was made usable again. This coordination required incredible trust. When sirens sounded, everyone should run to shelters, but the runway repair crews continued working until the last moment. The pilots were the heroes of the sky, but it was these invisible heroes who got them into the sky. Toward the end of June 1940, the first reinforcements reached Malta. Hawker Hurricane fighters. On June 22nd, just 3 days before the fall of France, the first 2 Hurricanes arrived in Malta via Bizerta. 4 more came the next day. The Hurricane was a generation ahead of the Gladiator. Single wing, enclosed cockpit, faster and better armed. Now Malta's pilots could fight Italian fighters on more equal terms. But this didn't mean the Gladiators were retired. As hurricanes took combat damage, mechanics needed time to repair them, and during that time, the old Gladiators took to the skies again. Flight Lieutenant James Pickering remembered those days. You'd take off in a Gladiator, climb toward the Italians alongside the few hurricanes on the island. Sometimes there'd be over 100 aircraft facing you. Clouds of bombers and fighters would fill the sky. And then, suddenly, you'd find yourself completely alone, because everyone else had passed you by. Yes, even the hurricanes left the Gladiators behind. But these old warriors continued to do their best. The Gladiators' last aerial victory came on January 24, 1941. Lieutenant Jackie Sewell shot down a German J-88 bomber. This was the last victory a Gladiator achieved over Malta. In total, Malta's Gladiators shot down at least 9 enemy aircraft and severely damaged 5 more. And most importantly, throughout the war, only one, Charity, was shot down during aerial combat.
In the final months of 1940, the people of Malta had begun to breathe easier. Italian attacks were intense but bearable. Hurricanes and Gladiators were keeping the enemy at bay. But in December 1940, everything changed. Adolf Hitler made a new move to seize control of the Mediterranean, and this move was called Ex-Fliegerkorps, the German Luftwaffe's most experienced anti-shipping unit. Transferred from Norway to Sicily, this unit consisted of approximately 80 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and numerous Ju-88 medium bombers. The Italians could harass Malta, but the Germans came to destroy. On January 6, 1941, the British Royal Navy launched Operation Excess, sending vital supply convoys to Malta, Alexandria, and Greece. The convoy's powerful escort included HMS Illustrious, the Royal Navy's newest aircraft carrier. This ship had dealt a heavy blow to the Italian fleet at the Battle of Taranto just a few months earlier, and now it was the Germans' #1 target. January 10, 1941. When the convoy reached the waters off Sicily, Ex-Fliegerkorps attacked. Stukas rained down from the sky. The shrill screams of their Jericho trumpets, wind-driven sirens, mixed with bomb explosions. HMS Illustrious was hit 6 times. 126 crew members lost their lives, and 91 were wounded. The ship was heavily damaged, but miraculously stayed afloat and took refuge in Malta's Grand Harbor. But the Germans wouldn't leave the job unfinished. January 16, 1941. The beginning of one of the darkest days in Malta's history. Morning clouds cleared in the afternoon, revealing a clear blue sky. And at that moment, radar screens began to fill up. More than 70 German aircraft, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Ju-88 medium bombers were advancing toward Malta. Target, HMS Illustrious, lying in repair at Grand Harbor. This was the largest air raid Malta had seen up to that point. Stukas began their dives from 14,000 feet. The shrill screams of the Jericho trumpets could be heard from every corner of the island. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, hurricanes and Falmers took to the air, and the bombs began to rain down. Incredibly, in this massive attack, only one bomb hit Illustrious. But the other bombs fell on the 3 cities surrounding Grand Harbor, Sanglea, Vittoriosa, and Cospicua. These cities were Malta's oldest settlements, established and fortified by the Knights of Malta in the 16th century. And now, they were being reduced to rubble. An eyewitness described that day. The dive bombers came in swarms, in great waves for more than an hour. From every angle they dived in almost suicidal fashion. They came down to within 100 feet of the harbor and released their great bombs. The show seemed as if it would never end, but when the last plane had gone, and the rumbling of the guns had first become an echo and then a silence, a great white cloud of smoke lay all over the harbor area. That day, over 200 homes were destroyed, over 500 were damaged. Civilian casualties numbered in the dozens.
And this was just the beginning. The illustrious Blitz began on January 16th, but didn't end there. In the following days, German aircraft returned again and again. On January 18th, in the third major attack in 3 consecutive days, Lucca and Halfar airfields were heavily damaged. 200 buildings in Valletta were destroyed. 50 people lost their lives. Throughout January 1941, Malta endured a total of 58 air raids. Compared to the Italian attacks, the intensity of German attacks was shocking. Italians usually dropped bombs from high altitude, protecting themselves at the cost of missing their targets. But the Stuka pilots? They made nearly suicidal low-altitude dives. Civilians began fleeing the cities in panic. From Valletta alone, 11,000 people, 2/3 of the city, were evacuated. In the first 4 months, the Luftwaffe dropped 2,500 tons of explosives on Malta, far more than the Italians had dropped, but far less than what would be dropped the following year. Over 2,000 civilian buildings were destroyed. Compare that to the 300 buildings destroyed during the Italian siege. By the end of 1941, approximately 70% of the churches on the island had been reduced to rubble. But Malta did not surrender. January 18, 1941, one of the most intense days of the illustrious Blitz. George Burges was now flying a Hurricane, and on that day he took off 4 times. On each sortie, he encountered waves of Stukas. The dive bombers were coming to finish off HMS Illustrious, and Burges gave everything he had to stop them.
That day, he almost certainly shot down 1 U-87 and damaged 2 more. The next day, January 19th, Burges flew 4 sorties again. This time, he definitively shot down 2 U-87 Stukas. He watched with his own eyes as both crashed into the sea off Grand Harbor. With these victories, George Burges officially reached ace status. He achieved a total of 7 kills during his combat career. But more importantly, the brave defense by Burges and the other pilots ensured Illustrious's survival. On the night of January 23rd, HMS Illustrious quietly departed Grand Harbor. Damaged but afloat, she set course for Alexandria. From there, she would travel to the United States for months of repairs. The Germans had failed to sink the ship they thought was unsinkable. Malta's pilots and anti-aircraft batteries had saved her. The illustrious Blitz taught the Maltese a bitter lesson. This war would be far harder than they had imagined. But at the same time, it revealed their resilience. After the bombing ended, civilians began emerging from the rubble. The wounded were carried to hospitals, the dead were collected and buried. And immediately afterward, life tried to continue. The dockyard workers were praised by the Royal Navy. The report stated, "The consistently high morale of the dockyard workmen, in spite of the hardships experienced since the commencement of air attacks on Malta, is deserving of special praise. In spite of heavy bombing raids and the unnerving effect of the mass evacuation of their families to the country, the men have been attending for duty as usual and working without complaint." This was the essence of the Malta spirit. Bombs might fall, homes might be destroyed, loved ones might be lost, but the Maltese would not give up. And this resilience would be tested every day for the next 2 years. In the spring of 1941, ex-Fliegerkorps withdrew from Sicily for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Malta found a brief opportunity to breathe. But the Italians were still there. And in December 1941, the Luftwaffe would return. During this time, the fate of the legendary Gladiators was sealed. Faith, N5520, survived. It served throughout the war and was eventually stored in a quarry near Lucca Airfield. Hope, N5531, was destroyed on the ground during an air raid on February 4, 1941. Charity, N519,
had fallen into the sea on July 31st, 1940, with Peter Hartley in the cockpit. Only one of the three legends survived the war. In the summer of 1943, the siege had been broken, and Malta had become a springboard for the invasion of Sicily. And on September 3, 1943, a historic ceremony took place. Air Vice Admiral Keith Park, hero of both the Battle of Britain and the Battle of Malta, gave a speech at Palace Square. Before him stood an aircraft skeleton without wings, missing tires, with engine cowling panels gone. Faith. Park presented this relic on behalf of the Royal Air Force as a gift to the people of Malta. Chief Justice Sir George Borg accepted it on behalf of the Maltese people. This day marked the closing of an era. Those outdated aircraft, unpacked from wooden crates, had made history. Faith is still on display today at the Malta War Museum. Deep within Fort Anselmo, it stands in silence. When visitors look at it, they can imagine those desperate days of 1940. 3 antique aircraft, 6 volunteer pilots, and the fate of an island. In Part 2, we saw the individual stories of Faith, Hope, and Charity's pilots and the hellish days that began with the arrival of the German Luftwaffe. George Burges transformed from a flying boat pilot into Malta's first war hero. Peter Hartley paid the price by falling from the sky in flames. And throughout all this, mechanics and civilians fought as invisible heroes. But the story isn't over yet. In the third and final episode, we'll see Malta's darkest hours and ultimate victory. In 1942, the island would become the most bombed place on Earth. Starvation would knock at the door. And just when all seemed lost, King George VI would make a historic decision. If this story has moved you and you don't want to miss the final episode, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Share your comments with us. Let's move on to the final episode.
And now, we come to the darkest, yet also the brightest chapter of our story. Because the heroism of Faith, Hope, and Charity wasn't enough to save Malta. They had only bought time, and that time was about to run out. February 1942, Malta was now the most bombed place on Earth. Yes, you heard that right. More than London saw during the Blitz, more than Rotterdam, more than Coventry. Never in world history had so many bombs fallen on a single location. From January 1942 to July 1942, for 7 months, there was only one single 24-hour period when no bombs fell on Malta. Just one day. Only one day of silence in 7 months. Every other day, every hour, sometimes every minute, death rained from the sky. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had received a direct order from Hitler. Raze Malta to the ground, erase this island from history, put an end to his threat to our supply lines to North Africa. And Kesselring set out to execute this order to the letter. April 1942 became the most horrific month in Malta's history. That month, more than 6,700 tons of bombs fell on the island. Let me put that number in perspective. It was more than the highest monthly bomb tonnage London saw during the entire Blitz. Germany was no longer trying to physically destroy the island's population. They were trying to demoralize them, break their spirits, force them to surrender. And it seemed to be working. Because Malta wasn't just being bombed, it was also fighting starvation. Submarines and bomber aircraft were sinking every convoy trying to reach the island. Food stocks were running out, fuel was almost gone, ammunition was being used down to the last drop. Daily calorie intake had dropped to just 1,300 calories for an adult male. That meant less than half of normal requirements. People were slowly starving to death. Communal kitchens called victory kitchens were established.
Only one meal per day was distributed there. The menu featured goat meat 5 days a week because they had been forced to slaughter all the goats since they consumed too much feed. Potatoes were mixed with wheat flour to produce a new type of bread called wheatato. Every gram was saved. Every bite meant life. Tuberculosis, rickets, and scabies began to spread. People lived in shelters for so long that they forgot what sunlight looked like. Children's bones weren't developing properly. And right at this moment, in the darkest days of April 1942, something unexpected happened. April 15th, 1942. King George VI sent a letter to the people of Malta. But this was no ordinary letter. With the letter came a medal, the George Cross. The British Empire's highest honor after the Victoria Cross. This award, normally given only to individuals displaying extraordinary courage, was being given to an entire people for the first time. The king's letter read, "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." This was an honor history had never seen. One island, one people, one medal. For 270,000 Maltese, in the darkest moment of the war, a ray of light. But the George Cross didn't stop the bombs. It didn't end the hunger. Malta was still fighting for survival. Governor Lord Gort sent an urgent message to London at the beginning of August 1942. If supplies don't arrive by September 7th, Malta will be forced to surrender. Surrender. The struggle started by the pilots of faith, hope, and charity would come to an end. 2 years of heroism would be for nothing. Right at this moment, the British Navy was preparing for one of history's most dangerous convoy operations. Codename Operation Pedestal.
On August 3, 1942, a convoy of 14 merchant ships set out from Britain. With them was a massive escort fleet, 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. 50 ships in total. But among these ships was one that Malta's fate depended on. SS Ohio. An American-built tanker with a British crew. She carried 11,500 tons of aviation fuel. Without this fuel, Malta's Spitfires couldn't fly. Submarines couldn't move. The island would be left completely defenseless. Ohio's captain, Dudley Mason, gathered his crew and said, "Our destination is Malta. You all know what that means. Ohio is the only tanker. We'll have to fight our way through with 13,000 tons of high-octane fuel. If anyone wants to back out now, speak up." No one moved. The convoy passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean. And hell began. German and Italian forces did everything they could to stop the convoy. Submarines, torpedo boats, bomber aircraft, everything was mobilized. August 11th, the first wave of attacks came. The sky filled with enemy aircraft. Bombs exploded. Torpedoes were launched. Aircraft carrier HMS Eagle was struck by torpedoes from a German submarine and sank. 260 sailors lost their lives. But Ohio continued on. August 12th, attacks intensified. More than 80 torpedo bombers, over 200 Stuka dive bombers, and 100 fighter aircraft attacked the convoy. Ohio was hit by a torpedo, but she didn't sink. She took bomb hits, but she kept going. 2 German aircraft crashed onto the ship, but the crew extinguished the fires. Another bomb hit the engine room. The engines stopped. but Captain Mason refused to surrender. Half sunk, engines dead, deck riddled with holes, Ohio was taken between two destroyers. HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury supported the tanker from both sides, practically carrying her toward Malta. August 15, 1942. The Feast of Santa Maria, a holy day for the Maltese. And that morning, thousands of Maltese gathered on the walls of Valletta Harbor saw an incredible sight on the horizon. Half sunk, deck burned, smoke rising from her sides, Ohio was entering the harbor between two destroyers, defying death. Captain Mason stood at attention on his damaged bridge. The band played "Rule Britannia." People were crying, applauding, praying. When Ohio reached the harbor, she began to sink, but crews worked without stopping. The 11,500 tons of fuel in her tanks were offloaded before the ship sank beneath the water. Of the 14 merchant ships, only 5 made it to Malta. Over 500 sailors lost their lives. But those 5 ships, and especially the fuel Ohio brought, had saved Malta. Captain Dudley Mason was awarded the George Cross for his courage, the second hero to receive this medal after the island of Malta itself. And then, everything began to change. In May 1942, USS Wasp and HMS Eagle delivered 64 Spitfires to Malta. This time, there was a difference. As soon as the aircraft landed, they were immediately refueled and back in the air in 30 minutes. The Germans were too late. They would no longer be able to catch these aircraft on the ground. Air Vice Admiral Keith Park took command and implemented a new strategy. They would no longer wait for the enemy over the island, they would meet the enemy in the open, attacking before enemy bombers could reach their targets. And it worked. July 1942, Canadian pilot George or Screwball Beurling arrived in Malta's skies. This young man was perhaps the deadliest fighter pilot Malta ever saw. In just 14 days, he shot down 27 enemy aircraft. He earned the nickname the Falcon of Malta. Beurling was an extraordinary marksman. While most pilots opened fire from 400 to 500 yards, he would close to 250 yards, then bring down his enemy with a single accurate burst. Pilots like him transformed Malta from a death trap into a hunter's paradise. October 1942. Kesselring launched one final major offensive, but it was too late. In 17 days, the Germans lost 34 Ju-88s and 12 Bf-109s. Malta's Spitfires were tearing them apart. On October 16th, Kesselring called off the attacks. This was the Luftwaffe's last major assault on Malta. And just a few weeks later, the news that changed the world arrived. At El Alamein, the British 8th Army under General Montgomery dealt Rommel's Afrika Korps a crushing defeat. Aircraft and submarines operating from Malta had cut Rommel's supply lines. German forces in Africa were left without fuel, ammunition, or food. That desperate defense that began with faith, hope, and charity had finally borne fruit. November 8, 1942, the Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch had begun. Germans and Italians no longer had the strength to attack Malta. They were forced to turn all their attention to Tunisia. November 20, 1942, the Stone Age convoy reached Malta with almost no losses. The siege was officially over. The siege of Malta, which had lasted 2 years, 5 months, and 9 days, had finally ended. But Malta's role wasn't over. On the contrary, it was just beginning. From December 1942 onward, Malta was no longer on defense. It was on offense. And what an offense. By May 1943, forces operating from Malta had sunk 230 Axis ships. 230 ships in 164 days. This was the highest Allied sinking rate of the war. Rommel's last hopes were also buried at the bottom of the sea. And in July 1943, Malta became the base for one of history's largest amphibious landing operations, Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. General Eisenhower, Admiral Cunningham, General Montgomery all directed the operation from the Lascaris war rooms in Malta. That small island, that 95-square-mile piece of rock, had now become the gateway to Europe's liberation. 150,000 soldiers landed in Sicily. 38 days later, the island fell. Mussolini was overthrown. Italy withdrew from the war. And then Rome, Normandy, Berlin. When the war ended, historians tallied the numbers. Bombs dropped on Malta, more than 14,000. Over 30,000 buildings destroyed or damaged. 1,581 civilians lost their lives. 50,000 people left homeless. 35,724 Italian Air Force raids, 37,432 Luftwaffe raids, a total of 154 days and nights of continuous bombardments, 100 more nights than London's Blitz. But Malta stood. Because 3 old biplanes and 6 brave pilots decided to attempt the impossible in June 1940. Faith, hope, and charity. 3 aircraft, 3 names, and the soul of a nation. Faith still stands today in the National War Museum in Valletta. She no longer flies, but she still inspires. The George Cross is there too, right beside her, along with the King's letter. And in the upper left corner of Malta's flag, that medal is still there. One island, one people, and the greatest collective courage award history has ever seen. This was the story of faith, hope, and charity. But their story was actually just a beginning. Because the unsung heroes of World War II aren't finished. In our next video, I'll tell the story of a man who defied an entire army alone in the heart of Nazi Germany. He was so brave that even his enemies admired him. He was so indestructible that death itself couldn't stop him. I won't say his name now because I want you to enjoy discovering him. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next hero. Tell me in the comments what you think about Malta. Which of the faith, hope, and charity pilots impressed you the most? And remember, history is the story of brave people. And we're here to tell those stories. See you in the next video. Take good care of yourselves.